unless we've done a lot of inner work, I think we either have an inner critic where we're making ourselves wrong or an outer critic where we're making other people wrong. And we tend towards one of those.
How can we make sense of that?
Dig through all of the mud of what the critic is saying. We can get to these underlying assumptions and decide, are they true or not true? Oh, I worked with a woman once. She was saying, you have to stay in this job or you're going to look ungrateful to the people who helped you get here. That was what her critic was telling her, even though she was really suffering in the job. And so we looked at the underlying assumptions, and the underlying assumption there was staying in the job means being grateful. And if we look at that, what's actually true is she wants to be grateful and she wants to leave the job. Those aren't opposites. They can happen at the same time. So I think looking at the underlying assumption can be incredibly helpful, because if that underlying assumption is not one that actually fits our values, then we can shift it and say, oh, look at that. The critic wants me to do these two things.
Are there safety considerations?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just share. I was in a really deep place of depression, and depression is a visitor that has come to me at different periods in my lifetime. And it comes with this pervasive sense that I have nothing to offer, that there is no possible future in which I will have something to offer or be different than I am. And so, yeah, it can be, I mean, I would say soul crushing, but it doesn't even feel like I have a soul in those moments, because I'm so disconnected from feeling. It's like, I can't feel anything. How am I supposed to feel gratitude? And it just became another should that I was putting on myself that I was failing at. I think sometimes in those moments, like any place of ease, even at just saying, gosh, this feels like a should, it's such a hard place. And there's no words that can necessarily help. When I'm in that depressed place, like feeling that it's not okay and feeling like I'm so wrong and bad is really isolating. So I'll share a story. There's a little trigger warning around suicide here. So I was in this really dark place, and a friend of mine came over and she knew I was really bad, and she said, you thinking, like, is it so bad you're thinking about killing yourself? And I was like, oh gosh, like many times when I get that question, it then comes with like, okay, now we're gonna have to make a plan, and you have to promise to call somebody if you're, in that moment. And I was just like too tired to do that.
I feel like we're in like a descent, a beautiful descent into some deep place. And if you've been following us this far, listening, I'm imagining you might be stirring with all sorts of different feelings and questions at this time. So I just want to name that. I don't know. I'm actually torn here. So I want to just kind of put the Welcome everybody back to Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. And I'm Gabe Crane, and I'm joined by my co-host Rahul Didwania. And if you enjoy listening to us, please share our work with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow along our journey by joining our newsletter, linked in the show description. And you can also follow us on YouTube, where our episodes are now available as well. You can find all those links in the show description. And today we are welcoming Rosi Greenberg, who's an artist of leadership development, in an episode titled Meeting the Inner Critic and Rewriting the Rules. And I'll get into introducing Rosi more in a second. But before we go further, just the title, Rahul, Meeting the Inner Critic. I'll set aside rewriting the rules for a minute, because I'm curious where Rosie's going to lead us on that. But tell me about the inner critic. I mean, I got a lot of thoughts on this topic myself.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe. I only formally, quote unquote, learned about the inner critic, or that term, fairly recently, like 3 years ago, maybe. This idea of inner critic or saboteur or negative self-talk, all these different terms for the same concept, I think. And have really benefited from it. You know, it's one of those ideas that once I learned about it formally, I was like, oh, that, yeah, I know that. Like, I have an inner critic in here. We're great friends. We talk all the time. And really, more than friends, he beats up on me all the time. And, you know,
One of those friends. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so really, you know, I think it's been a very interesting learning for me, and a topic I'm very, very fascinated by. And I truly believe that everyone, like every single person listening to this, every single person just in existence, has an inner critic, you know, and this is one of those few topics that I think is so universally relatable. And just knowing that, you know, having this association or this framework for thinking about this voice within ourselves, you know, that we view as critical and view as taking us away from a version of ourselves, you know, that we want to be, is really, really interesting. You know, and even that way of looking at it, I realize is maybe incomplete, because there's so many, the next step, right, is how do you relate to this so-called inner critic? And there's so many different ways to do that. You know, there's a version that's about conquering it, avoiding it, sidestepping it, getting around it. And then there's a whole other version, which is around, you know, I used the word friend earlier, right? Inviting it in, relating to it with compassion, actually developing a friendship with this voice and understanding that it's also there for you. And if you view that as a spectrum, you know, I think there's a whole range of techniques and concepts and ways of thinking, you know, to relate to this character, right? That's so frequently present in our lives. And, you know, I'll just say right now, I feel like I'm around this character a lot, you know, whether it's imposter syndrome with work situations, whether it's how I'm spending my time, whether it's, you know, how I relate to my family, and whether I'm doing all these to the best of my ability or not. And, you know, we'll get into a lot of this, I'm sure, later on. But just to directly answer your question, I think this is one of those topics that's very, very meaningful to me, and I think also has immense practical value. So I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. And I'm curious for you, Gabe, what does this topic mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head with a number of things you brought up, and so I'll try to not be redundant. But I think one of the things Rosie's going to be getting into here with us is this notion of the imposter syndrome. And certainly, you know, as now we're in year 3 of this project, I know, you know, when we think back to, you know, when we started this, just all the different inner hurdles that we both had to conquer, you know, just to get this project off the ground. And I can definitely relate with that sense of imposter syndrome. It brings my mind also to Ren Shui, you know, the system we talk about a lot that I teach Qigong from within. And that system and its founder, Yuansa, often talks about the life itself, the universe, as inherently loving and trusting, and kind of like kind of a good with no opposite. And I think when we get into the ins and outs of our day-to-day, life doesn't always feel that way. But I think when I think of the inner critic, it's something that, for me, I experience going beyond just imposter syndrome. It's negative. It's just the experience of life in the negative. And when I have the time to really like look at what my inner dialogue is saying so much of the time, just like the automatic chatter that's filtering through my brain, so much of it is fear-based, is negative, is contracted in its energetic quality. And, you know, I just think, I guess a curiosity that comes up for me around that is when, if ever, to listen to it. You know, you were talking about having different kinds of relationships with our inner critic and having a friendship. And, you know, when I put on my kind of more academic hat, you know, I can think, oh, well, there's such a value to criticism, right? Criticism is an important part of the scientific method. It's how we learn and refine intelligence and understanding. And so I'm really curious to kind of get Rosie's picture on that. And what I'll just say is that last is that for whatever reason, I don't know why, but last night I woke up at 3:30 in the morning with my son, Satori, and I couldn't go back to sleep. And I just noticed so much. This wasn't the reason I couldn't sleep. I was just awake, but within that space, there was so much negative self-talk just swirling around. And I just found myself in a mindful place and being present to it all. But just being like, wow, this is just wild, and I ended up teaching about that at a site I teach here on Maui, and talking about that. And it's just, I feel like it's so relatable because we all have that, even when things are going great, we've all had that night of waking up and feeling that way, or just walking around in our regular day to day and feeling that way. And so I'm really excited to see what Rosi has to share with us and what she can shed insight to for us on this topic. On that note, I do want to introduce Rosi Greenberg. She is an artist of leadership development. She spent 15 years fostering a more connected, humane, and creative organizational landscape. Thanks, Rosi, for being with us. And I just want to say there's a lot more to your bio I can get into here, but what I really want to share is that when I knew you were going to be our guest, I got to get on your website and look at some of the art that is in this book that you've created. Everyone has a Sam, which is the name you've given to your inner critic, and I'm sure you'll share more with us about that. But the art is so evocative. I think it just, for me, it just, a picture says 1,000 words, and it just clicked so much the way you show this little shadow, joining you in the drawings that you're doing, or in the writing you're putting together on the book itself, or a shadow on someone's shoulder walking along. I feel like my inner critic is like in my hair, like grabbing my eyeballs and, like peeling them back a lot of the time. And so I just, I want to give that plug to your work. It's just very visually evocative and beautiful, and really brings this topic home immediately. So that's that. And on that note, Rosi is the founder of Drawn to Lead. She's offered bespoke workshops and retreats that have been empowering thousands of leaders to unleash their narratives and find their inner critic. And the book, Everyone Has a Sam, Meeting the Inner Critic and Rewriting the Rules, tackles imposter syndrome through Rosi's own vulnerable personal story. And I'm excited for us to get a little bit more into that today. So Rosi, thank you so much for being here with us. And I guess I'm just curious, as a first take, you just heard Rahul and I blab for a few minutes about this. And I'm just curious if it sparked anything of particular interest to you, who spends all your time talking about this topic.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for having me and for being willing to explore this part of our lives. I really love the way you each describe just the swirling nature of how we can get into those thoughts, and how it feels like they're just swirling everywhere around us, and we can get kind of stuck underneath them. And in the book, of course, some of the illustrations are about getting stuck under my inner critic, Sam. But then, Gabe, I love also what you shared around just the experience of the universe and the world as this place of love and light and divinity and care for us. And so I think there's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition almost of those two, of this human experience of disconnection and fear and self-doubt and self-loathing even. And the bigger, like, it's okay, it's all okay, we are all divine beings that also exists. And so in some ways, I think of this work as like kind of recognizing and almost honoring the human condition of disconnection, and bringing us into connection first with the disconnection. So first, like, I love, Rahul, what you were saying about 3 years ago, getting to know your critic and being like, oh, wow, this thing is here. And it starts with that connection and bringing connection to the spaces of disconnection, so that then we can honor, like, wow, what is this experience? Really dive in and find the wholeness. And there's so much more to dive into. I love the spectrum you were creating around how the many different responses that we can have to the critic, and this question of when do I listen to it? How do I find the wisdom? So I'm excited to dive in more, but that was just the resonance that I heard, and gratitude for just the presencing of both the very, very small, fearful, stuck parts of ourselves and this bigger, open, flowing, divine parts of us.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot, I'm sure that we're going to go into here, Rosi, and we'd love to just start with the basics. I think we've kind of been operating with a assumed definition of what an inner critic is, based on our own experiences, and maybe we do have some common language between ourselves. But for someone who's never heard of that idea, right? What is this thing that we're talking about? What is the inner critic?
So for anyone who's never heard of it, you're very lucky. If you haven't, so the inner critic to me is a negative internal voice that gives us messages of not enoughness in many different ways. It might say you're too lazy, you're not doing this right, you're too fat, you're too skinny. And often it doesn't even say we just think of it as I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I'm not good enough, there's something wrong with me, there's something pervasive about me that means I don't belong, or I'm tricking everyone into thinking I'm a good person. And that goes into imposter syndrome too, that sense of I'm tricking everyone. And if they only knew what was true about me, they wouldn't like me, or I wouldn't be part of this group. Some people call it the gremlin, the saboteur, negative inner voices, the inner critic. It's this negative self-judgment. And I also want to say one piece, it may be that not everybody has this. And it sometimes is the case that if we're not judging ourselves, there's this outer critic that we're putting all of this judgment out onto the world. We're saying, well, I'm great. It's everyone else who's terrible. It's everyone else who doesn't belong. It's everyone else who's not good enough. So unless we've done a lot of inner work, I think we either have an inner critic where we're making ourselves wrong, or an outer critic where we're making other people wrong. And we tend towards one of those, but sometimes we have both, and it's in any given moment that we might be doing it to ourselves or doing it to other people, or both.
That last point you just mentioned really kind of arrested me, of the movement of the inner critic, but for some people, or many of us, it's externalized. And I was like, oh, wait, I I do that. I know people in my life who do that. And I guess it brings me back. You drew out from what I had shared in the intro about this notion of a loving universe. It brings me back to this question about criticism to begin with, or the critique to be negative. And in your experience and the way that you're working with this, is there a place for that? How can we make sense of that? Because on the one hand, I can look at it and kind of say, well, it's just toxic. It's just it's not nice to foist on someone else. It's not nice to feel it inside yourself. And as you said, it comes from a sense of not enoughness. So on the one hand, I can see it as just a misperception. It's been foisted on us by the way we've constructed our society, and it's bad. It's something to be rooted out and eliminated. But also, as our intro comments alluded to, maybe there's some value to it. Could you help us understand that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces, one at a societal level and one at an individual level, and they're kind of based on the same tenet. So in any critique, there is an assumption about the world that is being made. Oh, I worked with a woman once. She was saying, you have to stay in this job, or you're going to look ungrateful to the people who helped you get here. That was what her critic was telling her, even though she was really suffering in the job. And so we looked at the underlying assumptions, and the underlying assumption there was staying in the job means being grateful. And if we look at that, what's actually true is she wants to be grateful and she wants to leave the job. And that those aren't opposites. They can happen at the same time. So I think looking at the underlying assumption can be incredibly helpful, because if that underlying assumption is not one that actually fits our values, then we can shift it and say, oh, look at that. The critic wants me to do these two things. It wants me to be grateful, and it wants me to be grateful, and it wants me to have a good job. They actually don't equate here to the answer that it's giving me, to the outcome or the conclusion that it's pushing me towards. But if we can really, I call it kind of panning for gold. If we can dig through all of the mud of what the critic is saying, we can get to these underlying assumptions and decide, are they true or not true? And then for us at our individual level, we can throw out the critique that is just unhelpful and take the wisdom that is, I want you to feel grateful to the people who helped you get this job. There's not only one way to do that. The way to do that might not be just staying in the job. Maybe you write a letter to them. Maybe you thank them. Maybe as you're leaving, you have a big goodbye. Maybe you get the next job and you help support. I don't know. There's so many different creative ways that we could do that. It's only by finding that underlying assumption and understanding the wisdom of what the critic's trying to say in its very young way that we can find that gold and actually really listen to it. In that way, it becomes almost like a risk manager that's looking at our environment and helping us figure out, how do I survive here? What's needed? What's expected? What are the risks? And it can give us real wisdom about that. Now, we have to get rid of the real mean, harsh critique. And then I think at a societal level, the idea of critique can happen in two ways. It can happen if we look at those deeper assumptions. Some of those assumptions are based in fear and are based in equivalencies that we don't actually want. So if we look at, for example, a society that's saying your worth is what you produce, that's an underlying assumption that we may not want to hold. And so there can be a very powerful social justice critique that is coming from a place of saying, hey, we don't believe that. And we can use the art form of critique that we're also good at pointing the finger where it's really necessary and saying, hey, these systems are not working for us. These underlying assumptions are not working. And that critique can be a very empowered, agentic critique that is coming out of a place of love. So I don't mean to say that all critique is harsh and bad and is inner critic critique, but it's a question of those deeper assumptions. Are they assumptions that we actually want to hold and live into in our deepest, highest values? Like if we were looking from that place of universal love, is that what we actually want to be holding? And many systems do need critique. Many aspects of our individual lives might need critique, but we can do it from a place of love and from assumptions of love rather than harshness.
This image you've painted, Rosie, has really gotten me thinking, and I think the word you used there, somewhere in the middle, is young, right? And even before you said that, what I was envisioning was sort of like a young kid, like a toddler that has an emotion that's connected to something they're actually feeling, right? And it might not come out with polish. It might not come out with any understanding of what that emotion is. Of course, many adults, including myself, we also operate this way. But I think you associate it sometimes with a kid that's maybe mad about something and they don't know what it is, and it just comes out in a tantrum. And that what you pointed us to here is really examining where that critique is coming from. And this idea that I'm hearing is that very often, I mean, I don't know what share, but very often the inner critic has some wisdom to what they're saying. And it's our job, and maybe this is where we will dip into later with rewriting the rules. Our job is to start understanding or build our own capacity to understand what the critic is actually saying. And in some cases, it will be positive and have wisdom. And also, I guess, in other cases, it won't, right? In other cases, it might be coming from some inadequacy or something that, I guess that's wisdom too, to connect with that and to notice that, in some form. So, one question is, am I tracking all that correctly? And then if so, just continuing to build the picture of this inner critic, when does it show up and how does it show up, and what is kind of the variation or commonality of experiences that people have in from what you've heard as it relates to the inner critic?
I love the example of a kid having a tantrum. So let's go with that. So 2-year-old having a tantrum, they're having some need that is not being met. Imagine in the family, there are so many needs. My family, I was one of 5 kids. So there were a lot. I was the oldest. So it wasn't when I was 2, but by the time I was 4, there were 3 of us. And so if I was having a a big need. There were also other needs, and it might have been a time where my mom is kind of where, a parent, in this case, my mom might be like, okay, sweetie, but we really have to get out the door. Um, and in just the course of a natural day in the life of family, it might be those harsh anger emotions that are kind of shut down and kind of hurried along. It might be wild creativity, like a kid who's out playing in the mud and stomps in to the kitchen showing their mud pie, and the parents like, oh my gosh, you're getting mud all over the floor. And so I think it's in these moments where our insides or our individual experience isn't mirrored by our outsides, by our surroundings. And a little kid can take in the message, I'm not okay, or I don't matter. And in order to kind of trust the outside, it's kind of a lot easier because we need to trust our surroundings and our parents, and we're dependent on them for our survival, our caregivers, whether or not they were parents. But we depend on them. And so in my case, for example, I realized it was in some ways easier to make myself wrong in order to be able to trust the outside environment, in order to be able to get along in my family, feel cared for. I'm like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. And then the rest of the world kind of makes sense. So I think that our critics are kind of created in those moments where we don't quite fit, and they help us fit. And that's really important because we depend on our families. We need our families. We need to be part of schools and organizations and groups and communities. And so our critics are just part of kind of learning the rules. And that can happen in a way of like these minor disconnections or major traumatic disconnections. So I think that's a large part of kind of how they're born. And then they kind of track with us for our lives, helping us fit in, helping us belong, helping us exist within the confines of the space, for better or for worse.
Yeah, that's so poignant. Just hearing you flesh. I've father of a 4-year-old son, and we were just having a conversation with another future guest about motherhood and parenting, and it's just the examples you're bringing are so close to home. Of just those moments of intersection where, okay, like I don't mean to be rushing you, Satori, my son, but like we got to get out the door, and he's just getting into this space in his consciousness where I'm seeing him process. I heard him apologize to me yesterday for not eating, quickly enough at a certain moment, and it's like heartbreaking, like being in like a reflective process around it, because on the one hand, it's like, well, good, because it's what I want you to do or I need you to do. And on the other hand, it's reflective of like this really complex process, which he just articulated really beautifully, and which is probably forming his own inner critic as we speak. And I guess that just brings me to more curiosity about your own personal journey with your inner critic, and kind of how you met your inner critic, just what that process was like, and how Sam came to be and have a name, and all of that.
I love that. Before I go there, I just want to say, for you and for all parents listening, don't let your inner critic tell you that you have to be a perfect parent. That's one of those things that they're like, oh man, you're doing this wrong. You're doing this wrong, and you're going to mess your child up. And it's like, no, right? Laughter there. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's one of the places to be like, what's the wisdom there? Oh, the wisdom is I love my kid, and I really want them to have a great life. Like, I love this person and I want to do my best job. And that's enough. Like, let's not beat ourselves up about the way that this happens, because everyone's going to develop this thing, and it's not a terrible thing. So if there was any shame there.
Yeah, no. I mean, there is, but it's beautiful to hear you reflect that. And I think it's just such an important message for all of us that are parents or caring for others. And yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I met Sam 2 years ago. He's been with me for all of my 36 years of life. But I met him 2 years ago. I was in a really dark place. He had basically kind of taken over everything. And I was teaching leadership workshops, narrative workshops at the time, and working with a professor of mine and friend and mentor, Marshall Gans. And we would go for walks around this lake near our houses. And one day on the walk, he was telling me about his late wife had migraines, and her doctor had suggested that she name the migraines as a way of kind of externalizing them. And it turns out that this is a common practice in parts work, internal family systems, which I've studied, and also in the world of eating disorder recovery. They name the eating disorder ED often. So he said, we got back, I think, to his house, and he said, well, what's your inner critic's name? Does he have a name? And in my head, I said, well, what's your name? And I heard back, Sam. And then I immediately heard back, gosh, that's a dumb name. You couldn't think of anything more creative. And for the first time, I said, oh my gosh, that's Sam. That's not me just beating up on myself. And I kind of laughed because I was like, wow, that's a good trick to tell me your name and then tell me it's a dumb name and beat up on me for it. And it was the first time that I had a little distance from Sam. And when I started then drawing out what he looked like and what he said, everything that he said became more for me to write and more fodder. So it just became funny at a certain point, because he would, I would hear, gosh, these drawings are ugly. And I would just write, these drawings are ugly. You got more? And anything he said, I would write. And I felt so powerful that it was like I won either way. And so the book kind of came out of that moment of my own journal entries and drawings. And it is my process. So at some point in the book, I start talking to Sam. Those actual pages that I drew were my journal entry, were me talking to Sam, and were his answers to me, kind of in this relational dialogue that we started having. Those are the actual pages of it. So it's very special to have kind of created a product out of it and shared it. And in some ways, it's like, again, tricking Sam, because now he gets to be the star of the show. And I'm a little more free of him. So it's kind of this sense of, partnering, but really noticing was the very first step.
Thank you for that, Rosie. And what I'm just synthesizing a little bit as we go is this idea that, hey, many of us have an inner critic. Some of us might have an outer critic or outer oriented critic. But with the inner critic, it's for anyone that has one. I imagine a lot of what we've been talking about, they can see themselves in it, right? I know that was my experience when I learned about this concept, whether it's imposter syndrome, whether it's anything small, right? Like, why did you name me Sam? Like, my inner critic's name is Bud. And it's like, where did that come from? Bud the bully. It's like, where did that come from? And it's just like, it's interesting, because it sounds like the first step, right, is what you just said, is around awareness. It's around starting to name the moments in which the inner critic is present, and making its presence known. And then, you can take that many steps further, it sounds like, by personifying the inner critic, giving it a form, giving it a name, giving it a voice, giving it a gait, just building this character, right? So that we can, and the way I always think about that is it gives us a shortcut. As soon as we're able to see that the inner critic is present, we can immediately shortcut to imagining this character present, and that helps with the disassociation, right? Because it sounds like that's the second step, right? So be aware when the inner critic is present, disassociate, and view yourself as separate, your capital S self as separate from the inner critic. And then it sounds like the third step is maybe inquiry, right? And or dialogue, I think you said, right? Is being in dialogue with the inner critic, and I'd imagine that's in service to trying to understand the inner critic and what it's saying and what it wants for you. So, question for you is: am I tracking that flow correctly? First off, I guess I'll just check with you.
Yeah, I name the steps a little different, and Sam is telling me I should have a fancy acronym for it. But yes, so I think noticing is the first step, noticing and naming. The second step is understanding its origins and understanding its intent. And then the third step is finding the wisdom, which we talked about a little bit, and then rewriting the rules, kind of using that wisdom. So noticing and naming, noticing what that part is, naming it, giving it an actual name. I recommend you don't use your parents' name to anyone who's listening and maybe thinking they want to do that, because it's your internalized voice of your parent, not your actual parent. So you could change it a little bit, but
I have had people do that, by the way, and early in my journey, I was like, "Oh, that's probably not healthy."
don't recommend it, but you do you. If you're like, that's really what his name is, great. Yeah, if you're listening and you want to try this, just ask in your mind's eye, like, "Hey, critical voice," or you can even ask it out loud. It might make fun of you, but yeah, like, what's your name? And just go with the first name that comes. So I'll be quiet for a second. You can do that. Ready? What's your name? Did you hear it? Go with the first name that comes, and maybe that's its name, and it can always change later. And then starting to notice where it shows up in your life, and I find that it's really helpful to shift from I messages of like, oh, I'm not good enough, or even just noticing like that pervasive sense of like, am I doing this right? And shifting it into you talk. You're not doing this right. You're not good enough. You're not whatever enough. And start hearing it as that, or even just noticing where it's popping up, the specific contexts maybe that it's coming up in more, where you feel more self-doubt. It might start just by noticing the feeling of doubt in your system. And it might start by like actually rephrasing those actual words, but just starting to see it. And usually in the first couple weeks, if you start to see it, you're going to start to see it everywhere. And it can be a little demoralizing because it's like, oh gosh, maybe I'm drowning in this. It's not that you're drowning, it's just that you're noticing. And you can see it now, which is the first step.
Yeah, on that note,
sorry.
Yeah, no. On that note about drowning, you mentioned at the outset like this feeling of being buried by it, and in your origin story of Sam, or at least naming Sam, you mentioned really being in a really difficult space, and so I'm curious if you could just expand on that a little bit for those of us who it's intense, and are there safety considerations or ways that we can kind of pump up the care factor in this so that as this critic does get unearthed, we're able to work with it more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share. I was in a really deep place of depression, and depression is a visitor that has come to me at different periods in my lifetime. And it comes with this pervasive sense that I have nothing to offer, that there is no possible future in which I will have something to offer or be different than I am. And so, yeah, it can be, I mean, I would say soul crushing, but it doesn't even feel like I have a soul in those moments, because I'm so disconnected from feeling. And in those moments, there was all this kind of self-help stuff around like, oh, you should do gratitudes every day and affirmations and those things. I tried them, but asking me in those moments to feel gratitude, it's like, I can't feel anything. How am I supposed to feel gratitude? And it just became another should that I was putting on myself that I was failing at. So I think sometimes in those moments, like any place of ease, even at just saying, gosh, this feels like a should, or gosh, I'm just in this place. Any place of ease and of just acceptance is, or even just accepting, like saying, wow, it's really hard to accept this, and letting that be okay. Like any place of okayness is the thing to do, because it's such a hard place and there's no words that can necessarily help. But if that practice of naming it feels like it might be helpful, and noticing feels like it might be helpful, then I offer it as an invitation. And the other thing, like to me, sharing and talking with people and sharing these voices, because that when I'm in that depressed place, like feeling that it's not okay and feeling like I'm so wrong and bad, is really isolating. So I'll share a story. There's a little trigger warning around suicide here. But a friend of mine, so I was in this really dark place, and a friend of mine came over and she knew I was really bad, and she said, you thinking, like, is it so bad you're thinking about killing yourself? And I was like, oh gosh, like many times when I, get that question, it then comes with like, okay, now we're gonna have to make a plan, and you have to promise to call somebody if you're, in that moment. And I was just like too tired to do that, and ashamed. But I just was like, yeah, sometimes, and without missing a beat. She said, oh yeah, I tried that once. I woke up in the hospital. The nurses said it was dumb. And all of a sudden, it was like that part of me wasn't so wrong. It wasn't so bad. And she trusted that there was something more in me that could hold that story of hers too. That, that she was speaking to, that then I found that I was like, oh, she trusts that I'm okay enough to hear that, then I'm okay enough to hear that. Anyways, I forget how I even got on that, but just honoring those dark spaces sometimes and connecting around them is important.
Yeah, what's particularly powerful and poignant about that for me right now is just last week I had a conversation with a very close friend who has gone through a certain amount of therapy and training such that they have the noticing stage down, and he goes through bouts of depression, and literally the way he was describing it, he's like, hey, lately, last month or two, he's like, I've just been inundated by and overwhelmed by my negative self-talk. He's able to notice it, and even label it, and I think that's been a big improvement for him relative to an earlier stage of his life where that wasn't even available to him, or he hadn't developed that capability or capacity yet. And he's still in the middle of it, even able to name it. I think it's still been very challenging. And so I'd love to actually go into that second step you mentioned around understanding origin and intent. I think when he and I were talking about it, that's actually where our conversation hit a roadblock, where he's like, yeah, like, I don't know, why it's here, what it's trying to say to me, and what it's about. And I'd be curious to understand, like, and I know for myself, even I'll say there are times that I'm able to reframe, see the wisdom and reframe and disassociate and thank it and move on. And other times, or even after naming it, I, go into some sort of reactive pattern, right? As simple as doom scrolling or doing something that numbs me, to that presence of that critic. And so I'd be curious to hear from you, Rosi, like, what does it look like to understand origin intent? How do we build that capacity? And just how do we do that?
Well, first of all, I have felt the like pushing, like, gosh, I want this to be done. I need to move to the next step now. Like, this should be a faster process. And sometimes it just takes as long as it takes. And in general, like our growth that we're going to do in a lifetime, it takes as long as it takes, which is going to be one exact lifetime in this lifetime. So, I have a lot of compassion for wanting it to go faster. And sometimes it just is going the pace it needs to go. But for that second step around understanding the origins, we may not know why the critic is there and why it got its job and why it came, but it sure knows. And so just like it knows its name, we can ask it. So in my workshops, I have people actually on Zoom, I'll say, go, you have like 2 minutes, go dress up as your inner critic and come back. And everybody will embody the role of their inner critic. So, I mean, we could practice it now if you even want, but so it would be like, Rahul, you would become Bud. And I would ask you some questions. Like, we start out with silly kind of questions, like, what's your favorite kind of ice cream? What's your favorite place to go? What's your favorite part of our lives? And like, what do you really hope for me? And then we get deeper, like, why did you have to come join me? Like, when did you get your job? Why? Like, what was going on then that you came? What would have happened if you weren't there? What did you protect me from? What did you create for me? Um, and what is it like? Why did you do that? And we can get to this place where the critics are like, I really care about my human. Like, I really care about this person. I want them to succeed. I want them to fit in. Well, why do you care? Well, I just love them. And folks can get this like visceral sense of why it was crucially important, sometimes even life-saving in their early family lives for this part of them to have come online. And I find that that embodied experience is incredibly powerful. Sometimes I have the critics then write their human a letter. So it's understanding its intent and its origin. And these questions come from shadow work that I've studied with Cliff Berry and Vicki Woodard and internal family systems, Dick Schwartz's model. Yeah, but it is almost, I would recommend for coaches, facilitators, for people who are looking to get to know this part. It may sound silly, but truly imagining that it's a new friend that you're getting to know and ask it the curious questions that are coming up, like that you would actually be curious about this like random entity that just showed up in a person's life. Like, why did you come? What would have happened? Like logical kind of questions about what was going on. And very, very, very powerful shifts in understanding can happen as people feel the embodied experience of that love.
I feel like we're in like a descent, a beautiful descent into some deep place. And if you've been following us this far, listening, I'm imagining you might be stirring with all sorts of different feelings and questions at this time. So I just want to name that. It's certainly going on for me, and I don't know. I'm actually torn here, so I want to just kind of put the wisdom out to both of you and to the universe. As you were mentioning before, Rosi, I want to move us along to the next step of finding wisdom, rewriting the rules. I want to know what that looks like, and then I'm also just like I'm imagining myself after this recording, sitting down and doing the exercise you just mentioned of like, okay, wait, who is this person? Like, I got to get to know you more. And so, yeah. And so part of me is like, maybe we should do some of that here now. And I'm not going to ask a question. I'm just going to like, just plop all that out for us and just take a breath and ask what does it spark for the two of you, and yeah, either of you, and where might we go?
I have an idea. What if we maybe we don't go all the way to childhood, but we could be our inner critics and just have a conversation about ourselves, about our jobs, about our roles, about what we know as the expertise that we hold as our critics for a couple minutes. How does that sound?
I love it.
Sounds terrifying. It's great.
Okay, so on the count of 3, there's going to be just a spark in this room, and we're just going to all of a sudden whoosh, become these entities. Ready? 1, 2, 3. What's up? I'm Sam.
I'm Bud.
I'm Eric.
Yo, Eric.
Yeah, I'm worried about my name because it's the name of a friend of mine who I love.
Of Gabe's friends.
So, yeah, Gabe's friend. Thanks. Yeah. So I think it's the wrong name, or I'm worried. I don't know if it's the wrong name. I'm more worried. I'm in a state of worry.
Yeah.
And I think it might be bad for Gabe if my name is the same name as his friend.
Yeah, I really hear that. What do you want for Gabe? What is it like that you're trying to do for him that you're like, oh gosh, this might be the wrong name?
I guess protect him from.
So you do, like, a lot?
I guess. I'm not really sure. I'm trying to figure myself out here. But I think I'm trying to protect him right now. I don't know, in general. And I'm worried about what could happen to him if, the wrong thing gets out, or, his friend Eric, who listens to this show and then makes some certain assumptions, or then if I'm, do I work out my own identity in association of that person that I know, or that Gabe knows, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's very insightful.
Well, I don't know if Rosie should have chosen this activity because I just think we have a lot of wisdom as these critics. Like, yeah, I just really I want Rosie to succeed. And I think she's great, but she can't live without me.
I don't know. I personally think Rahul is not that great. He's got a lot of stuff to work on.
Yeah, what should he work on?
I mean, for one, he shouldn't just today he played chess for 45 minutes to distract himself when he has all this other shit to do. I'm like, what is he doing?
What'd you tell him?
Why is he wasting? I mean, as soon as I noticed, I was like, what are you doing? You're wasting time. You just always get distracted and waste time.
Good for you. That sounds like some really good pushing on him. As
a
member of this critics council, I'm like, yeah.
There you go. Now we're talking.
Yeah. What'd you really want for him, though?
I wanted him to do what he had set out to do for the day.
Why?
Because I feel like that's what he wanted to do. He was excited to do it. And then he got a little, I don't know what happened. He just got nervous about getting started and started playing chess. And I was just like, what's wrong with you?
What
do
was
the thing you're supposed to be doing.
Like, what was it that you saw that he wasn't seeing there about the risks of him not doing that stuff?
That he wouldn't actually feel good at the end of that time. They'd actually be like, man, what did I, that he would regret it.
Huh. So you actually didn't want him to regret something?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, because I know when he's regretting stuff, he doesn't feel great about himself. And when he actually follows through with the thing he's excited about or wanting to do, he feels good, and he feels capable and powerful and positive and all the good stuff.
Why do you want Rahul to feel capable and powerful and positive?
It's a good question. I get excited, I guess, when I see him that way.
Why?
Because there's something about that. I kind of want everybody to be that way.
Huh.
If they want to be, of course. But
so it sounds like you're kind of misunderstood in some ways. That what you actually want is for him to be capable and feel capable, powerful, excited, because you just love that feeling. And he loves it.
Yeah. But then why doesn't he do it? That's the part I don't understand.
Yeah. Well, why not?
That's where I come in, knocking on his door or on his head.
well, I'm stepping out of Sam role, but like, or maybe not. But what if there was another way to get him to do that that would make him feel even more powerful, even more capable, and even more excited more of the time? Would you want that for him?
Yeah, but I guess that what would that mean for me?
Would mean you get to take on a higher role in his life.
Well, that sounds great. How do I do that?
You could tell him exactly what you just told us of what you actually want for him. Of I see you doing this thing that I don't think you exactly want to do. And I know you'll feel more powerful, excited, capable at the end of the day if you do these other things. How would that feel? Like
I
become
feel like
almost,
he knows that. I feel like he knows that.
yeah. But
What
he's
would
not.
my telling him do?
Well, how do you think you could be more of a, like, there's motivation that can come from that deeper intent that you have for him.
Mm,
It's actually going to motivate him more than the motivation that's coming out of scarcity and fear.
yeah. I've seen that a few times actually,
Yeah, like one.
and it works great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just reminded of it. I didn't couldn't envision it before, but last week we had an interaction like that
And tell us.
where
Yeah.
initially I was kind of beating up on him, because he sucks at time management. But then it turned out, he actually didn't react to me, and just like we had a conversation. I don't, it was quick, but I was like, oh, actually, yeah, like I just want him to do certain things that actually he already wants to do.
So having a conversation actually worked better than shouting at him.
I guess so. Yeah. I still default to shouting, but I think you're right.
So it sounds like you're already starting to take on this elevated role in his life, being kind of an ally and almost a like a board member with him rather than like a taskmaster with a whip or something. What would help you do that more with him?
I think if he invited me to do that more, yeah, because I think I just shout and he runs, and that's our little song and dance, and we're so used to it.
Yeah. I bet he's a little scared of inviting you to do it more because you've been shouting at him. I would be
I guess
scared.
that makes sense.
So what feels like a good next step for you two?
I don't know why what came to me is just having tea together. I don't even drink tea that often, neither does he. But yeah,
Love it. Yeah, I advise people or I think about like how do we recontract for these roles? Like what is it that the human in the human critic relationship needs and what is it that the critic in the human critic relationship needs? Just like any other relationship in life. And like how can you find a like roles that feel actually even better for the critic because you'll like bud you'll get listened to way more than you were. It must have been incredibly frustrating to be screaming at someone who's not listening to you. Like that sounds awful. Um, but having this role of like trusted advisor where you're valued and you're listened to sounds way better. So whatever steps you two can take to really shift that, that's the next step after noticing and then understanding the origins and intent. Then you can really shift the roles, and then together you rewrite the rules of your relationship first and then of how you want to live together. Yeah. Before we switch back, anything to share, either Eric or Bud or Sam, as our humans? Anything we want them to know?
Well, I feel that I'm just learning a lot watching Sam and Rosie talk to Bud and over there with Rahul from my own perspective. And there's just so many parallels around, like, thinking about the elevation of this, of who I am as Eric, as the critic, to a different role in Gabe's life, and thinking about protection in a different kind of way. And yeah, and I'm noticing the terror / enjoyment of this uncertain exercise that we've undergone, and just feeling really grateful for it. I guess as Gabe, I don't know if Eric feels that way. Although I think as Eric, I'll say that it's pretty cool to get some airtime. So I'm I'm enjoying that. But yeah, this is very beautiful.
I'm feeling as Sam, like I hadn't really appreciated how much Rosie honored and elevated me in her life through this work, and I feel like really proud to be seen and to have this like book and work dedicated to me, because I've been working really freaking hard for her, and I deserve it. It's like I deserve to be seen. I deserve to have this elevated role, and like, yeah, I feel powerful in a really healthy, good way, and like I would do anything for her.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious for Rosie and Sam here, and any combination thereof, around this rewriting the rules, which we just did, and in a beautiful way, through example. And I think you articulated that, Rosie, quite well. But can we do a second pass there? What can for anyone who this was an confusing, engaging yet confusing experience in the last few minutes? How do we can we get a voiceover? How do we do this? What just happened, and how do we find wisdom and rewrite the rules when we encounter the critic? Because I'll just say for myself, as we're going through that exercise, I was noticing the change happening inside me as it was happening, and then alongside there was this voice being like, "Oh my God, what's happening right now?" Like I'm confused. There's like multiple names. I'm like, my brain's exploding, right? And then the other part was like, "Whoa, this is like amazing. Like, what's like, I just gotta breathe and go closer." So I don't know if I'm the only one having that experience, but I suspect not.
Highly relatable.
Yeah. We set up like more of a container for kind of going in. We just went in real fast, and Bud, I just want to say thank you for the courage to go there and to be vulnerable and to be a model for that for everyone. Like it's not just you two; you're kind of holding something for the whole system and for anybody who's listening. So just like deep bow and thank you.
Thank you. And I should mention, I forget if I even shared this with you, Gabe. I attended one of Rosie's workshops like a long time ago, like very long time ago. And that's when I had the chance to see, Rosie's work. And we didn't do the dress up part, but we did the conversation and the letter, from the critic. And I have it somewhere here, actually in this folder. And it was really cathartic, in its own way, and in a way that this was too. And this was even more condensed, and yet you can still encourage that shift that you were alluding to, Gabe, that you were feeling. I was certainly feeling it as well. And yeah, love, Rosie, for you to kind of talk about what happened, to Gabe's question, and help us understand it even better.
Yeah, so and we're shifting out now, but we shifted into the character of our critics. And I was kind of from multiple perspectives, just kind of asking our critics questions, like the questions that I had listed before, but just like, oh, what do you really want for your person? Why? Well, why do you want that? Well, why is that important? Um, and trying to just understand with compassion um, and just curiosity why they're doing what they're doing, with no, if there's any anger or frustration or we like wanting to make the critic go away, we kind of need to put that aside for a minute. And that's why kind of embodying the critic can actually help. So trying on this character and then speaking to ourselves from that character. If you're alone, you can do that just by writing, writing to your person, like, here's what I want for you. And here's why, and here's why, here's what I really think. Here's what I'd like to do for your life. I want you to listen to me more. And just sharing those thoughts as our critic, it is good to have airtime. So giving the critic some airtime can help us understand, like, what does it really want for us. And what we got to was that Bud wanted something really powerful for Rahul, wanted Rahul to feel empowered, capable, to feel good, essentially, to feel successful. And that's a beautiful thing. And the way he knew how to do that was by screaming and beating Rahul up. But there's actually other ways to do that. And he thought of one that was actually even more powerful than beating him up. And so what we did at the very end was kind of start to recontract and think about, well, how could they come into a new relationship, these two kind of the bigger self part of us and our critic part, such that it actually works for both parties involved. So what are the ways that we talk to each other? When do we talk to each other? And I think as a human, just saying, you need to talk to me nice and I will listen. But if you talk to me mean, I won't listen. And I want to hear what you have to say, can be really powerful. So that's the piece around shifting the roles and finding the wisdom. And then rewriting the rules is thinking about, okay, given all of that, given what the critic deep down wants for us to feel powered, empowered, capable, what are the rules that we want to live by, where there's not just one way to feel that? It's not just by being mean and not playing chess that I can feel capable. But maybe it's okay to play chess sometimes for 20 minutes or for even 45 minutes and then go back to the work. Or maybe, to say that it's okay to take rest and it's okay to work, to kind of hold all of the different parts of who we are, to have more options in any given moment. So another activity, we won't do it together today, but another activity is you can kind of embody almost a loving fairy godmother type part of you that knows exactly what you need and exactly the rules for life that would be most life-giving and helpful, and write to the human part of you from that perspective, of what are the ways to live today, given all the things that the critic wants, all the things that the human wants, all the things that need to happen, and that like loving, deepest sense of just compassion. So there's all of that. And this is all coming from this very loving voice and part. And to be honest, some people just need distance and space and boundaries, because if the critic is talking to them so meanly, it's okay to say, you cannot talk to me like that. It's not okay. That's abusive. And set a real boundary with it, just as you would with a human in an abusive relationship. Come talk to me when you can actually talk nice. And that's okay to say. You don't need to be all like loving and compassionate if this voice is just completely beating on you and there's nothing nice about it. You can very lovingly and very firmly say no, and set a boundary about how it needs to communicate with you. And in my experience, they will start to do that as long as you really hold that boundary. Every time it comes up, you say, I'm not going to listen until you talk to me nice. So
A question I have for you, Rosi, is, thank you for taking us through that whole arc, right? The 4 steps. And I feel like I've had this feeling that I kind of have right now where I'm living into that new contract, right? The reimagined contract with this part of myself. And I've had this feeling a few different times, right? So going back to the first time I became aware of this and gave it form and did that first step of noticing and awareness and then went through this arc and as I was mentioning much earlier, there are times when I feel like I'm able to operate from that place and appreciate the wisdom of the critic and really harness that. And then there are many times, if not maybe many more times, where I feel like I'm not able to access that, right? As he smiles, right? It's like the familiar
Yeah.
patterns. I mentioned that the song and dance, right? that Bud was talking about. Many more times I feel like we just go back to that, right? We go back to what we're used to. And I feel very blessed again to have this, even this intellectual understanding of this concept and these tools and these steps and these questions and this way of relating. And in spite of that, I often am not able to employ it, and this has probably been the biggest question I had even coming into this conversation is how do you make this stick, right? How does that, and maybe it's a practice, you constantly live into it and that's the cycle, I don't know, but I'm curious if you have a take on that, because that's the question that I keep coming back to around this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it takes us like 3 minutes to describe these steps, but I think it's like a 3, 5, 6, 7 year process that it just takes time. And I think the sticking is about just kind of constantly embodying that sense of curiosity towards ourselves when we can, and then we lose it, and then we come back to it, and then we lose it, and then we come back to it. Um, I don't know, like last week I was in a really, really spinny place of just like, I was like, I'm making myself wrong about every single thing in my life. And like, I was like, I know this is Sam. I know this is the thing that I teach about. I know all of the things that I'm supposed to do right now. And this just really sucks. And you know what I did? I cried on the couch for 30 minutes because that's what I needed to do. And I was able to not blame myself for crying on the couch for 30 minutes. And I was able to just hug myself and cry on the couch and feel awful. And then it passed, the next week. And that's progress to me because before I would have been blaming myself for crying on the couch for 30 minutes. So I think it's just practice, and it's especially like noticing the progress even in the worst moments. And I wish I had a magic wand, but that wouldn't be nearly so interesting and fun because, as we said at the very beginning, it's all about kind of how do we be more human, and like going through this is a way of, I don't know, like clawing for our deepest humanity and fighting for it in every, or maybe not fighting, maybe that's a bad metaphor, but standing for it, hugging it, reaching for it in all the moments, including the hard ones.
Hmm.
So.
Well, thank you, Rosi, so much. I mean, this has been a very dense 70 minutes just now, and it's giving me a lot to think about. I'm sure for folks listening to this, I'm sure the wheels are turning. And I just hope it leads us towards that vision that you just described of more humanity, more care and empathy in the world for ourselves, for one another. And so I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you so much for this work that you're doing and for sharing so deeply of yourself. It's been a real honor and treat to get to drop in with you. And along with that, yeah. And along with that, I guess I just wanted to ask uh, if there was something that you wanted to leave folks with to, along with all the other things they're carrying forward from this conversation, but just a final thought or something that you feel could be helpful for them. Is there anything that comes to your mind or Sam's?
I think just inviting everyone to take a breath. That was a lot that we talked about, and it can open up a lot as you're listening. So don't forget to breathe. Don't forget to feel your feet on the floor. Don't forget to put your hand on your heart if that feels right. And don't think you're alone in this. Like, if this brought up something for you, talk to a friend about it, talk to a support person, write about it, like use all of the incredible tools and supports, nature, all of the things that you have. Don't don't uh, don't be alone in it, because this is not the property of any one person thinking that we're wrong. This is a pretty universal and systemic phenomenon. So let's join together in shifting it rather than thinking that we individually need to just sort ourselves out. Yeah. And thank you both for this beautiful, exploratory, unexpected space to do just that, of sort and be curious in community about these really wise, annoying, wonderful, effed up pieces of us.
Yeah, Rosie, thank you for leading us through that, and always appreciate that call to community. I think that's something that we talk about a lot on the show as well, and I know I have an orientation towards thinking I need to just solve all this stuff on my own, and it's it leaves a lot on the table. And with that, I actually want to invite you, Rosie, to share, a number of the things you have going on. Of course, we've mentioned the book. I know you have a master class, you have a swag store. I was wondering if you can just speak to that. And for those listening, we'll also be dropping all that into the show description as well. But would love to hear your voiceover, Rosie.
Yeah, thank you. So you can, at everyonehasasam.com, you can find the book. You can buy either a signed copy or click through to Amazon. If you get a signed copy through me, through this podcast, you can use the code WINGS, 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 for a $5 off discount. But also at everyonehasasam.com, you can sign up to hear about the next 6-week masterclass, which will start in May. That's where we take a deep dive together in facilitated community to explore all of this. You can contribute a Critic's drawing to our Critics gallery and see inner critics from all over the world, just incredibly imaginative creatures saying awful things. It's wonderful to see. There's also some resources up on there, and you can click through to my swag store where you can get some Sam swag, which is at lovethatmess.com/shop. But you can also find it on everyonehasasam.com.
Awesome. Well, Rosie, thank you so much. This has been a really beautiful time today. And for folks listening at home, you can follow those links and next steps with Rosie. And just generally, as Rosie invited us to, take some time to be kind with yourself, to really move and sit with the material that may have arisen for you today as we've explored this, and see if that name that came through in a whisper when Rosie invited it wants to have a conversation with you, and see where that might lead in terms of making your own life better and therefore making the world a more beautiful and vibrant place. So on that note, go ahead, Rosie.
I'd love to hear from you and your critic. So if you listen to this and you came up with a name or any of these questions popped into your mind, reach out through the website and let me know, because we're always curious to hear that. So sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. Yeah, please do that. That's really great way to connect in. And so on that note, just want to say thank you all again for joining us for another episode of Woven Wings Live. As always, you can find our own links and works in the show description. You can follow along our newsletter. Please like this show, share it with a friend who you think it might be helpful for, especially this episode, someone who you think it might genuinely be helpful for. Love for that to reach those people. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you for our next episode next time. Take care and happy living.